Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. This is the two-parter, but it's the last class for the fall. We'll take a break and then see what I use the term spring for anything after January because of academic year. So we'll see what the spring brings. It's hard to imagine using the word spring in January, but that's what I do. Okay, so the future of Christianity in the church, no small topic. So we're going to dive in. This is a fairly famous quote. It is actually not Phyllis Tickle's. It's attributed to her, but she was quoting an Anglican bishop, Mark Dyer. About every 500 years, the church feels compelled to hold a giant rummage sale. It's a really great line, and it happens to hold pretty well. I mean, it's not exactly 500 years, but the markers that he/she, and quoting him, identify as Pope Gregory I, which is in the late 6th century, really more into the 7th century. He does all of these great reforms. This is after the fall of the Roman Empire. The phrase, it's a little bit debated, Gregorian chant comes from his influence. It's a revival of the church. Okay? So then 1054, these are dates you have to know in seminary, is the schism of East and West. So Christianity now, fast forward to today, has these three families, which we don't tend to think of. In the States, we just think about Protestants and Catholics. But there's a split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern, what would become called the Orthodox Church, 1054. And then, obviously, 1517 and following, it's the Protestant Reformation with Luther and Calvin. And then, of course, today, roughly 500 years later, pretty close to it actually in this case, which I just simply called a state of flux. There is, no question, there's a decline. We'll talk about that. And then there was this pandemic on top of that, which I think's complicated a little bit, and we can figure out whether or not it's accelerated it or really changed it, whatever. Okay, so there's just the basic premise. So here's the question, or not the question, but her observation about it. So she says three things then happen. A new, more vital form of Christianity emerges. Right? In all those cases, a new form emerges. Those first three cases. The organized one is reconstituted. Because of this challenge that's issued to it, it kind of sees itself anew. And then the Christian faith, in those first three, is spread into areas that it wasn't so prominent before. But the question then is, can you then say that because these 500 years sort of have this in common, that the 21st century would have that at the same time? And
by new areas, do you mean places?
Geographical, yeah. So do these past trends hold true? Is a more vital form of the faith emerging? Or is Christianity in the church in decline like never before? Okay, that's the opening question for me. What is your take on the state of Christianity in the church? And here's how I want us to get started. I really want you to pair up just for a couple of minutes. I mean, like 4 or 5 minutes. And both of you take a turn saying, here's how I see it. You don't have to be on the same page, but, like, do you think, and you might want to separate the question. Christianity and the church aren't the same thing. You might want to camp out on one of those. You might want to talk about our congregation instead of the big picture. However you want to do it. But really, are you optimistic, pessimistic, somewhere in the middle? How would you answer the question, what's the future of Christianity in the church? So just take a few minutes with a partner and just in pairs. There's only 13 of you, so I'll sit with somebody, and then we'll process what you're saying to each other. All right, so I know you could talk much longer, but what are you saying? What are you hearing? How are you voting? What's your feeling?
And with Blair is sort of.
I'll start. I'm optimistic.
Optimistic.
I mean, I see what is going on here, and then I see what's going on with the students that I interact with at Chicago, and
Can you make sure people know what that means?
yeah, I'm on the board of the Disciples Divinity House that's connected with the University of Chicago School of Divinity. And DDH basically provides scholarships and room and board and lots of financial aid to.
So as a person who's not only in a church, but on a board of a seminary, you're optimistic.
I'm optimistic, because,
Okay.
I mean, when I interact with the kids that are graduating, I mean, it's.
The
they're
kids, huh?
amazing.
The kids.
Well, I mean, compared to me, they are. They probably wouldn't appreciate that, but still.
Okay, somebody else?
Al and I agreed we're probably kind of middle of the road, but maybe tending towards pessimistic, just because at least for me, the numbers are just not there right now.
It's what we read and hear.
Mm-hmm.
It's not from interaction with young people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think of the shift in a different way. I think if you look at those time periods of 500 years, that the initial one, moving away from the Roman Empire, there was a shift in mythologies, going from multi-theistic or gods and goddesses to monotheistic. And I don't see this mythology in which we live now sustaining it so much longer, primarily because of scientific discovery and technology. That the mythology is changing, that what it means to center anything around a word we use that is God is very different from, I'm sure it was different in those histories, but I think the shift is bigger.
So, negative then?
Well, we agree there's a need for spiritual community. Well, what does that mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think there'll always be some kind of spiritual community, some kind of coming together around belief systems
Right,
and meaning making. Whether it
Gotcha.
looks anything like the church.
right, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit what perhaps what might be an elephant in some rooms. It came to mind the way that you so clearly and crisply and precisely presented to us the history and the different groupings, within Christianity. Then looking at demographics, I spent a fair amount of time looking at demographics of different religious groups, and brings up in my mind LDS,
Okay.
Mormons, because one is, and it might get off of tonight, I don't want to take a different track anywhere, but one is theologically. I think different people have different educated people have different views as to whether LDS should fit on a larger worldwide Christian map,
Right.
or not. And then whether they do or they not, or they don't. There seems to be a lot of consciousness almost always within LDS, among LDS leadership, about growth and size.
Mm.
And is there something to be learned from that focus that those folks have that can be borrowed from or adapted for purposes within this church and within this denomination?
So let me ask you, are you positive or optimistic or pessimistic or somewhere in the middle?
As new Christians, we are super positive.
Yeah.
There's no way for anything to go off track as far
Right.
as we see it.
You're on the honeymoon period. Right. Well, when people take the prepare and enrich instrument for getting married, and one of the questions says, do you think romantic love can ever fade? And they always put no. And you just kind of say, okay, good luck. Okay, so
Married, and I know it's funny.
so here we go. We're going to jump in. First, I want to start with limitations. This topic requires humility because it's anything about the future. Who can predict the future? My March Madness brackets fall apart the first weekend. I'm not the prophet here. I'm not making predictions, but just, that comment. I have made predictions in writing, in an article years ago and in a book, and when I look back at one of them is 30 years old, I'm like, that was pretty decent. I mean, I didn't bomb. I didn't predict the Final Four, but I did pretty good. More recently, it's too soon to know, but again, don't know, this isn't, okay, what's the answer? Like I used to tell my students, the answers to this are not in the back of the book. It's not geometry. Second thing, I think it requires a lot of disciplines beyond the usual biblical theological, because we're really dealing with culture here and sociology and lots of other influences. And then you got to focus, and it's probably too much to say Christianity and the church because that's really different. They're related, but they're different. We're going to focus mostly on the future of the church in the U.S., but with glimpses into other developments going on. So just to kind of put a filter around this or a fence around it. I don't usually do this, but I need to start with a joke, okay? So the guy goes to the doctor. He's got a lump. They've talked about it. They do a biopsy. Come back in a week or two. Comes back. The doctor says, well, I've got good news and bad news. Which do you want? He says, I'll take the bad news. Okay. Well, the lump is a tumor. It's malignant. It's terminal. You've got about 3 weeks to live. And the guy's just, oh my God. And then he's, wait, there's good news? This weekend at the club, I shot my lowest round ever. I tell that to my doctor friends who are golfers. They enjoy it. Okay, but, and here's the reason I'm telling it. What if the church's white blood cell count is abnormally high, dangerously high? It indicates something's maybe wrong here. Doesn't have to be, but those numbers say something. And we'll talk more about that. But can we recover? Is there a cure for this? Is this just, like the body's always trying to heal itself? Is this a virus and you'll be well in another week or so? And because the doctor obviously is totally out of touch with what the good news is there really good news? Not just for the doc who shot his best score, but is there some kind of good news out there? I'm going to also use this metaphor, this medical metaphor of the health of the church, and maybe a few other metaphors, but I also am going to use this format of good news and bad news. So we're starting with the bad news, and I'll just tell you up front, the good news is not until next week. So unfortunately, we're mostly going to be looking at things gone wrong in the, we got your numbers back on your fitness exam. We're going to have to make some changes here, right? Okay, so I'm going to show you a lot of observable symptoms. Some of it's anecdotal, some of it's more researched. Starting with our favorite Mexican place in Phoenix called Taco Guild that happens to be in a United Methodist church. Well, what used to be United Methodist Church. My son-in-law and daughter are going there this week, and I said, oh, you got to go to Taco Guild, and especially get the Mexican street corn. It's unbelievable. But they still have the stained glass windows. It's beautiful, beautiful building. That story's being repeated all over the country, not just among United Methodists. On sabbatical, 20-something years ago, all those great cathedrals, they were pretty much empty. They had in the back, inside the sanctuary, or in the narthex, a gift shop. And we would go in those, look around, and we'd buy a bookmark or a coffee mug. But this was 20-something years ago. They were mostly empty. We're going to come back to that. You don't have to read all that. I'll just tell you this one. So when I get paired up with people, if there's a doctor, a general contractor, and a policeman, everybody in the group wants to talk to them about whatever they're in. Talk about how fast people are driving, how many tickets are you giving, the Black Lives Matter. They'll ask all kinds of questions. They ask the general contractor, well, how come the supply chain's so messed up? When I say I'm a pastor, used to be a professor of theology, they're like, okay. I mean, they might say, well, I don't usually cuss like that, But they don't say, well, can I ask you about St. Augustine and his influence on whatever? And they don't even say, what kind of church is it? They don't care. And as I put on the slide, in the 4th century, people complained about going to the barber and the baker because they could not get out of the shop without being asked their views on whether the Spirit came from the Father or from the Son. Homoousia. I mean, it's like, this is light years away from that. Nobody cares.
Especially not if you're a disciple.
I don't know if it even matters. I don't know anybody that cares, to be honest.
they don't care or that they don't want to look stupid because they don't know what kind of intelligent question to ask?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know. I just find it interesting that very, very few who show intellectual interest in a variety of things, because you're with them 4 hours, have almost none in theological, biblical, ecclesial questions. They just, I don't know. I mean, it's a valid point, though. Maybe they don't know what to ask, and they at least know something about supply chain. But then that would be an indication of the demise of Christianity, that it used to be more people in the culture would have had conversations. Like in the 4th century, everybody was. Church of Scotland, 97, so that's pretty recent. They actually named the year they will cease to exist. 2033, not far off. And lots of traditions within the states have not gone on record like that, but their number is clear in their mind. In 2011, Canadian magazine predicted that religion will be driven toward extinction. This was a study by sociologists, and you can see the countries there. They based this on census data and 2 principles. It's more attractive sociologically to be a part of a majority than a minority, and that there are some economic advantages to being a part of that where religion is in decline, to be a part of that majority. And they say they could prove that. And then they didn't guess anything about the U.S. just because the U.S. doesn't have census data. So these other countries will put that kind of data in their census. In 2012, Douglas John Hall said there were 50 churches for sale in Montreal, several of them cathedral-sized. And then he quotes about Copenhagen, London, Berlin. And this is a story repeated everywhere, where boutique restaurants, lofts, whatever. Okay, so then the Pew Research. Within Judaism, interesting trend. 25% of Orthodox, so that would be to the farther right, have switched to conservative, which is that middle, or Reform Judaism, which would be to the left. 30% of conservative Jews have become Reform, and of the Reform, 28% have moved away from the faith. This is according to Pew Research, and they do very good work. And I'm sort of teasing you here because I set up a time last week and talked to Michael at some length about, so what do you think of the future of Judaism and the synagogue? Told him what my take is on this, which I'll make clear next week, and then he shared his. Yeah, mine is positive, but in a way you might be surprised. So, okay, seminaries. The pandemic did produce a slight uptick in enrollment at seminaries. The seminaries had been going down, no question. But here's the bad part of that. It's a very temporary uptick, and enrollment in the MDiv degree, which is the standard theological degree to go into pastoral ministry, it just keeps plummeting. People want to do counseling, or they want to do social work, they want to do something, but they're not interested in being pastors of local churches. So a lot of people say, well, if denominations are predicting their demise, and seminaries are saying it's not looking good for us providing ministers, and of course we know churches are closing, they're becoming restaurants. This is this is our x-ray, right? I just put that x-ray up and we're like, oh my God, every bone in the body's broken, right? It's not quite that bad. There is some evidence, this is really interesting, I don't know if you heard this on NPR, that the pandemic surprised scientists that it impacted personality. And the reason they said that was personality is very hard to change, and especially across the board. You know, to have whole groups of young adults change personality is incredibly rare. They don't know if it's temporary or not, but they said things like navigating social situations, trust, creative thinking, responsible action, etc. So it just got me to thinking, if a pandemic can alter personality within a pretty good sized body of the population, what is its impact on religion, Christianity, and the church? So a couple of things to go along with that. My opinion that voting patterns, I think it's a positive what the pandemic did, because it's made access easier, and especially where there is this bullying that can go on. But most people would say the pandemic's impact on houses of worship was not good. I mean, maybe there's the silver lining would be what? That the people who couldn't get there before the pandemic and still can't get there can now have a much better streaming experience. But generally, the in-person experience, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But so I want to bring this up because we have this, I would call it naive notion that as a country after 9/11, after the pandemic, we're gonna come together. And I remember vividly that in 9/11. I also remember walking in our neighborhood during the pandemic, and everybody was so friendly to each other. And I thought, where did they come from? These people are so friendly, you know. There's so many times on our walk, I will say hi to someone, they just look at me. They don't even say hi back. And I think, was I not projecting? I mean, did they not hear me? And everybody was friendly. Not so anymore. So I don't know how a pandemic can somehow rally religious zeal. I just don't see that. My own view is that what the pandemic did, and I'll talk about this more next week, is it didn't change anything that wasn't already happening, but it maybe accelerated it. The decline was already happening, but it could have accelerated it faster than we would have ever guessed. I mean, maybe the Church of Scotland says, oops, we got to change our number. Most post-pandemic studies say that most congregations are at about 60% in person what they were before. So if you are discouraged by the numbers in the room, you should at least take comfort in the fact that this is pretty much across the board. There are some interesting studies to suggest that among evangelicals the number is higher. And there's some interesting theories as to why, if you want to talk about that.
Which number's higher?
Evangelicals for returning to in-person. Theirs is closer to 80% in places. But this one's interesting. Even pre-pandemic, the new normal for asking the question, are you a regular church attender, was yes if they went once a month. And it wasn't that long ago that the researchers used twice a month and 3 times a month as the barometer. So clearly the bar has gotten lower for answering. Now that's their own response. They're saying, I consider that regular. But if the culture considers this regular, and now this regular, and then this regular, I don't know what that means. And then I couldn't help myself. Clergy report little interest in attending worship if it weren't their occupation. I don't know if you can make too much of that, because some of that could be burnout in the moment and could feel very differently after 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 9 months, whatever it is. But this is pretty common. Okay, and again, Pew Research. This is the last of the symptoms, by the way. Fewer than half of Americans will identify as Christian by 2070. And they base that on a couple of things. The bottom thing is that there's growth in non-Christian religions, but coupled with the exodus. There are people leaving the Christian faith and leaving the church. And you have this one statistic here that people who've grown up identifying as Christian, 31% of them are unaffiliated by the age of 30. So roughly a third of the church growing up will exit by the time they're 30. That's the current projection with the rise of these others. So eventually we're the 48% or whatever. Okay, well, so I'm going to do a couple more things and then we're going to talk some more, okay? Are you totally depressed or overwhelmed? Okay, that's good. That's what I was going for. Remember, this is the bad news. There's going to be good news next week. Won't have anything to do with my golf score. All right, so yes.
Is there a parallel to Scripture at a time that seems to be as hopeless as it is, and what the response might there probably weren't pollsters.
Yeah, we're going to
We
talk.
have them today.
We're going to talk about that next week.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yep. It's a good question. Okay, so the book, The Death of Christian Britain. It's the most thorough study that I know of, and here's his observation. It took several centuries to convert Britain to Christianity, but 40 years is all it took for the country to leave it. Now, they haven't left it in the sense of it doesn't, it's not like it doesn't exist, but you get the point. He notes that for 1,000 years it endured things like the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution. But since the 60s, people in Britain have stopped going to church. And just to kind of give you one big picture, a lot of people say, if you want to know the future of Christianity in America, look to Europe. And if you want to know the past, look to Asia and Africa. That a lot of what is happening there is the way Christianity was here in the 50s. And so, again, you can't prove that, but there's some suggestion that that's kind of a pattern. So I'm going to try to summarize. It's a big book, a lot of data, but here's some numerical indicators. This is 2000, so it's 22 years old. 8% attend Sunday worship. Would you have guessed it was that low? It's pretty low. Less than 25% are members of any church, and less than 10% of children attend a Sunday school. Okay, so
Ask a question about that 8%. When that said Sunday worship, are they including churches that have services on Saturdays or Friday nights or?
yeah. And his work is primarily in the Church of England, the Anglican Church, but not exclusively. He does look at British Baptists and evangelicals and Catholics, but yeah.
What's the standard for attend Sunday worship at all, ever?
Yeah.
Once a year even?
Right. Now here's his thesis. It's a little bit complicated. Women in the UK were the main supporters of organized Christianity from 1800 to 1963. Here's a big picture, he says. Prior to the 1800s, or to 1800, men were the primary movers in Christianity and the church. But starting around 1800, women started to have more influence. He also notes that's when women started to be angels. The angels in paintings and art started to have feminine characteristics instead of male characteristics. The angels in the Bible, the two that are named, are males. But women, 1800 1963, had the most influence, and they influenced their husbands and children to go to church. So, for instance, during the post-war years, post-World War II years, women who'd entered the workforce, of course that was to help the boys in the troops, they returned to domestic duties. While they were in the workforce, these magazines, and he's just done all this research, it's really interesting, they were writing these articles of defending women's rights and what does it mean to be a worker in the workforce. But when women went back to domestic duties, they went back to menus, housekeeping, this kind of thing. Now you could ask, well, which one's shaping which? But this is an observation. And then he says, the reconstruction of female identity within work, sexual relations, and new recreational opportunities from the late 1960s put not just feminism, second wave feminism, but female identity in collision with the Christian construction of femininity. And he uses these indices that, there was some decline in the 50s, but in 63, and that's where he says it really drops off, it just starts to plummet. So here's how he continues. He's not a Christian, by the way. He's not a church-going person, and a lot of people reading the book go, oh, he just has got sour grapes. But he said he takes no joy in the demise of the church. In fact, he's kind of happy because, not because of the demise of the church, but for this reason. Christian Britain, prior to 63, well, women's roles, they were seen as only housekeepers. So it's a positive to have this liberation movement. Church and state, they censored books and movies. Sunday, the pubs were closed. The parks were even closed. And then the criminalization of homosexuality. So what he's celebrating is that there was this social political move of progress, as he would call it, social justice, and the church, well, held on to its old ways, and so there was this exodus. The women had a new identity, and because men were influenced by attendance by the women, this is the beginning of the end, he says. So, now how are you feeling?
So how do you put core in? I mean, they're opening new churches all over the city.
Okay.
They're an aberration.
Well, but wait, what's the point? What are you trying to say?
Well, they're not declining.
Okay. Well, okay, so a couple of things. Their attendance is not what it was, and they've not had the return that anybody else has had. But just because you are taking over another church or starting something new doesn't really invalidate the observation that things are on the decline. Because mostly what, and I'm not just picking on core, mostly what church starts are doing are taking people from other churches. There's not a mass exodus of non-Christians into Christianity because core or anybody else opened a pub church or whatever. These are people who migrate to more critical mass. And if numbers matter to you, you look at a church that's bigger and so you say, well, they must be doing okay, and so there's a migration, but at the expense of some smaller churches. And there is pre-pandemic, and I'm sure it's not going to change, pre-pandemic, it was pretty clear people were predicting that there were churches too big to fail, kind of, that recession talk, and that little churches would also probably survive because they were smaller and nimble, but that middle churches were probably in the most, so core obviously would fit in that big one, and one of the reasons that middle could be in danger is because of that exodus to the bigger thing. So, I mean, it's complicated, no question.
One thing is, it's the attendance seems to be, or I think is most of the studies that I've seen, based on attendance at worship or Sunday school. And what I've seen here, and I'm not saying that it hasn't declined, because clearly it has, but there may be less attendance on Sunday mornings, and I guess I'm talking pre-COVID. But there's more people doing more things in service areas than they were before. And I will say that my 40-year-old daughter a couple of years ago said, who is a non-church goer, in fact, she would tell you right now she's an atheist, I don't believe her, but anyway, she said that she thought she misses the church, number one.
She misses the church?
Yes. She wishes she had a church home. She wishes her wife would find a church because then she would feel comfortable going. She doesn't want to be a hypocrite, but she misses the community of the church. She also said if more people knew that there were churches, and I'm not just blowing off horn, but that where the focus was like the focus is here, a lot on service, that more people her age would be interested, but that people don't know that. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, no, it's a good observation. It's a lot to take in, so just where?
I'd like to take a guess at it.
Okay.
Is it possible that we have made a case for Christ and Christianity? It seems to me that if you have these kind of statistics, talk about God, spirituality, those sort of things, the numbers would go way up. Then, when you start to talk about, do you believe in Jesus? Yes. Do you believe in Jesus as the Christ? It's shaky. Do you believe in Jesus as the incarnate God? I'm not sure that the churches have made the case for that as much as they have for secular humanism.
Wow.
thinking out loud.
Yeah, yeah. So when you say make the case for that, you mean that there can be multiple kinds of Christologies, or what?
Sorry.
When you say make the case, we haven't made the case. Which case are you talking about?
Yeah, Christology. Yeah.
Okay. The complexity of that, or
I'm sorry, what?
the complexity of that,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, I think so. I think that when you get into some of the hard sciences, it's making more of a strong case towards theology,
Hmm.
psychohumanism, for example.
Okay.
Just my
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, I think one of the other issues is going to church is just like exercising and everything else. It's kind of a habit. And if you develop the habit when you're a kid, I think you're more likely to do it when you're an adult. Whereas now, all the kids have soccer, and they have basketball, and they have football. And we never had any of that would occupy Sunday morning. I mean,
You have an ironic analogy because you're using sports to say sports. Yeah.
well, but you get what I'm
I get
saying.
you. Yeah, I
mean,
totally do.
it's-
Well, yeah, in '99 when I was on sabbatical in England, touring these empty churches, I also was floored because I had never seen it in the States at this point that there were soccer practices on Sunday morning. I was shocked. I mean, now, of course, it's common here, but it wasn't here then. It's that recent that we moved to the Sunday thing. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of people who every week will email Catherine or Tyler or somebody and say, sorry, we can't be there for such and such. We got a soccer match or dance recital or whatever, and Sunday at 10:30. Yeah, and which is, another signal that the society says, well, there's a day of the week you can have stuff, and it didn't used to say that. Even when we weren't, in the 50s, it still didn't say that even in the 80s and 90s, really.
Then the question is, what's the importance of the church to Christianity? And I would say that the importance of the church to Christianity is community and being better able as a community to bring God's kingdom, as it were, on earth than as individuals. But, I don't know exactly how to feel about the more evangelical churches, and this is probably an overgeneralization because I am only aware of probably the ones who do this, but they have what I would say checklists. If you want to go to heaven, you do this, 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 and this. And you go out and you promise the people, if you want to go to heaven, you do this, 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 and this. And it is attractive to somebody who wants to go to heaven without thinking too hard.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I'm being a little cat,
Yeah.
sorry, but I think if that draws people, that still doesn't make me want to be in a church like that.
So if you split the question and said, are you optimistic about the church's future, and are you optimistic about Christianity's future, would they be different votes, or?
They might be no, I don't know that they would be, because I do think the community is essential to the continuation of Christianity.
Yeah, and the research shows there's always going to be Christians who are not part of Christianity, or not part of the church, right?
Also Christians that are part of Christianity.
Well, yeah, but I don't know how you define that,
No.
because there's a form of Christianity that's said, are you a Christian, as opposed to, are you Christian? And the a Christian one is, here's what you got to do to become one. The other one says, this is who I am. May not be very devout, I may not attend, but my point is, Christianity could have a separate future from the church. The church is declining. Christianity could still be very meaningful to some people, but yeah, your point though is, yeah, I mean, we get it. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit more and then we'll talk some more. Okay, so Brown, he does a lot of stuff, but one of the things he does is he contrasts institutional Christianity with discursive, is his term. I'll unpack that. Institutional just means what it sounds like, adherence to church and worship. But discursive is his term for the way Christianity positions itself within society. What kind of status does Christianity have within the culture? And so secularization, as he would define it, isn't just a drop in attendance, which again, he has a lot of numbers, but it's really a non-Christian worldview or a secular society that it's emerging. He uses some numbers to do this. So like in 1900, 60% of infants born in England were baptized in the church. That's pretty impressive. 97, 22%. Again, that's 20 years old. 1900, 85% of marriages were performed religiously. 1997, 39%. And of course, again, the numbers have gone down since then. He documents then not just the continuing decline of organized Christianity, but the death of the culture which formerly conferred Christian identity upon the British people. So in other words, for him, it's the air we breathe, it's the water we swim in, used to be a Christian thing, and it's not. And then this just corresponds with what scholars call postmodernity, this notion of, postmodernity gets a lot of bad rap, but it's basically a different way of being in the world. It's a worldview, it's a meta-narrative, you can call it a lot of things. Postmoderns would say, maybe there is such a thing as universal truth, but who has claim to it? There are some that would say there can be no such thing as ultimate truth. Others would philosophically go, yeah, it probably does exist, but who's got claim to it? Do you? I mean, what, you have an MDiv, you're going to have claim to it? Come on. So there's just a kind of skepticism, questioning, it's very scientific. So this kind of goes back to something we did in another class with Charles Taylor, A Disenchanted Age. His question is a little bit awkward the way he words it, but I'm going to paraphrase it. Why was it just a given that in 1500 everybody believed in God, and why is it so hard to do so now? That's really what he's getting at, even though he phrases it. Yeah.
I can offer some observations on that.
Okay.
One thing is the rate of change,
Okay.
the acceleration. Everything has been changing faster and faster, and the rate is continuing.
Right.
And you put that in the fact that we have had nothing like a Great Depression or World War for 50, 60, 70 years, and people start to feel they're in control.
Uh-huh. So
It's just an observation.
yeah. So would you then say if we did have a Great Depression or something equivalent to it, that earth-shattering, more so than the pandemic, that could,
I think so.
it could bring about some revival?
It brings about, it would get you back to the idea that, there are some things I just can't control.
Right. Yeah. The sociologists of religion would say, probably not. And the reason they say that is because the world has changed. And that even when they just would say, that's like saying after 9/11, we're all going to hold hands and get along. They say it's just not going to happen. But who knows? It's predictions.
Well, yeah, but the other part of that is how much more we feel we are in control of.
Yeah.
My parents' generation did. for
Right.
example.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
I would say that in the 1500s, it may be that, and I base this totally on historical fiction, so it might be more fiction, but my sense is that everything revolved around the church in communities and small rural, and everything revolved around the church. And a lot of horrible things went on in the church. Nevertheless, the consequences of not being part of the church were a lot worse than they are now.
Mm-hmm.
The immediate,
Sure. Sure.
obvious consequences, I should say.
One last example from my experience. I grew up in a farm town. And farmers are entirely dependent on things they can't control.
Right.
And that affects their fate.
Sure, sure.
The need for it.
Yeah. Okay, so just to be clear, for Taylor, others, an enchanted worldview, that's where belief in God's the default. Disenchanted, which is what he says we're in now, it's where, yeah, I mean, that's one option. You can have a God option, and I'll have a bicycle club option. We ride bikes. You find meaning in the church. I find meaning on bikes with my friends. And he also uses this phrase cross-pressured. So this is where I think it gets more complicated. So for instance, cathedrals are mostly empty across the world. But people still want to be married in those places. How do you explain that? Well, that's what he calls cross-pressured. In other words, there's kind of these fond remembrances, and for some reason, and this is true even of the mega churches that don't look like a church, they look like a mall or whatever, the people mostly there do not get married there. Some of them have 2,000 people every Sunday. They would never get married there because it doesn't look like a church. But they want it to be their church. They don't want their church to look like church on Sunday. They want it to look like an auditorium and a concert hall and a stage. But when they go to get married, there's this, and so that's what he calls cross-pressured. There's a longing for it, but the question is, will that longing continue or not?
Married and buried too.
But cynically, I might say that the marriage part, in a lot of cases, probably has to do with the background for the pictures.
It does. It does.
As opposed to it being a church.
Right, yeah,
religiously.
that's true.
Just talking about marriage, it's my impression that nobody gets married in this church anymore. They get married at an event space downtown.
Well, no,
How many, we
Before
used to
the-
have 5 and 6 weddings a weekend.
well, before the pandemic, we still had a good number of weddings.
Okay.
The pandemic changed everything. But yeah, event spaces are becoming more
I mean,
popular.
The few invitations we
Well, I
get
think they-
anymore to go to a wedding,
Right.
it's not in a church, but it's in an event space.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to but that third point is worth talking about. Spirituality becomes a matter of choice. You're into prayer, I'm into kale. And you're like, kale? Huh?
That's the first slide where I've seen the word spirituality. So where does it fit when you talk about secularism and organization?
Yeah, I mean, it probably fits into that new category they've had for a while out, spiritual but not religious. There's this kind of spirituality that's not defined. It's just this middle space where for some people it's very meaningful to be a part of the church. For others, spirituality is used loosely for what do I get out of being a part of the...
So it's clubbed into secular?
Depends. I think it depends. Yeah. Again, this just goes back to what Taylor and others talk about. There's more mobility than ever in our society, but no clear destination. More access to the good life, but to what end? A sense of malaise. I mean, this is just identifying generally the culture in which we live. These are characteristics, which would lead religious people to say, the church can provide something for that. We can talk about what this means. But if a society says, well, of course you can, that's one option, but there's this other option, and I'm into, and then they fill in the blank. They create, it's kind of like a cafeteria, and they create their own spirituality. Like I'll go down the line with my tray. No, yeah, but I'll take this. Nope, but I'll take that. You have a yoga class at your church? I'll take that. Bible study? No. And we're creating our own kind of spirituality. Paul Tillich is definitely I would say one of the two most influential theologians of the 20th century. In the 60s, he described the longing for progress common in prophetic literature. So we're talking about the prophets in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And it was later picked up by Christianity. So the prophets did have a scheme of God is going to return us to the land and restore the fortunes of Zion, that kind of language. Christianity picks up on that. And then, of course, American culture does too. But he says similar notions show up in all kinds of areas. For instance, science. We put a man on the moon. Why do we do that? Why does Rice play Texas? That's what Kennedy said. You know that? He wasn't going to say that, but he did. He was speaking at Rice University. He said, we're going to put a man on the moon. Why are we going to do that? Why does Rice play Texas? Because they can. And why are we going to put a man on the moon? Because we can. So there was this notion we can do this. And what Tillich's point is, there was this notion that we got from the Hebrew prophets, extrapolated into history, put into science. We're a people of progress. We can get better. We can do things. It's not what ends up happening. Tillich says in the 30s, when he would criticize students' theology, they didn't care. Okay, sure. But when he criticized the American notion, he was a German-born. When he criticized their addiction to progress and the Americana dream of everything's getting better, boy, they just could not take that. He just said it's part of our American psyche. And then, of course, theologians note a lot of things in the so-called Christian century of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, etc.
That's what I'm talking about, a background.
Yeah.
And the Great Depression part of it.
Right. So, okay, some people, hinting toward next week, would say, yeah, but what about resurrection? Christianity has this notion of resurrection. Some people take that literally, which would be about as positive as you can. Some people take it as the most powerful metaphor there is. But either way you interpret that, people would say, well, there's a construct on which we could build some hope. Even out of death can come life. My pushback on that, I'm not saying anything about the resurrection, but I'm saying, can you necessarily extrapolate that into the church? The fact that Christ is raised from the dead by God doesn't necessarily say, I mean, there's not a verse that says, and if the church ever dies, I'll raise it from the dead. There's not a verse that says that. So, is there any good news?
There must be, because we're having a class next week.
Yeah, but my thesis is really, it's got an asterisk. It's got an asterisk. Here's actually my real question for next time. If Christianity, should say Christianity and the church were being publicly traded, and I made up a ticker for it, CHCH, would you be buying or selling? Now, this is not an IPO, you understand. We've been around for 2,000 years. And it has gone up, and it has gone down. And financial people say when a stock's down, you should buy because that's when it's on sale, right? But not all stocks rebound. So would you buy or sell? That is a very interesting question. And you can separate it. You can go, okay, there's a stock called Christianity. It's publicly traded. It's going for $100 a share. Are you going to buy or sell? There's a stock called the church. It's going for $100 a share. You're going to buy or sell? I mean, that just puts it in very stark terms.
Well, it's a financial decision when you're making a socioeconomic judgment.
True.
Social judgment.
Who in your view has the most at stake as to whether it goes up or down?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question because as a person who taught in a seminary for 30 years, we were worried about the future of Christianity. What we really meant was we were about the church. What we really meant was we were worried about the seminary going under and what are we going to do? Because this is what we trained to do. And the pastors are worried because they're looking at not attendance, they're looking at the giving. And they're worried, well, like this is what I do. What am I going to do? I'm not trained to do anything else. And sometimes ego gets wrapped up in numbers too. But yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. Who has the most to lose? If there are seminaries closing all the time. There are churches closing every day. Well, not every day, every week churches are closing. So who has the most to lose? I don't know. I mean, certainly the professionals are worried about it. Some people would say, well, society has something to lose. It has it's very demonstrable throughout history that Christianity has done some amazing good. It's also demonstrable that we've done some bad things, but
So Mike, and if you think about your question here, I think I kept thinking all hour about, it's the lack of the CEO, right? There's not, this has been happening, and there really hasn't been a leadership movement against that trend, right? Organized or otherwise, right? So if this was a business, right, at some point the shareholders would get together and they would say, hey, listen, we really see a trend here. We'd like to see it stopped, or we'd like to see this different.
yeah.
So one of the things that I think about for our conversation next week is a little bit more centered around who is actually in charge and what are the outcomes? What are we doing that for?
That's a
Right.
really interesting
Right. The
way to
second
look at
part
it.
of that, though, I find fascinating is that one of the big books around like factfulness, right? So you start to look at like what is the perception versus what is the actual reality of crime, right? So crime's never been better, but everybody thinks it's bad, right? Obviously, the last 2 years have been rough. My concern is that if you look at marriage, if you look at sort of these things, it's never been stronger, right? It's just for a certain group, right? So all the things that you think about, this group continues to get stronger. And there's a massive group, right, in our
So
society.
when you think about Christianity, the church, then, are you saying under this last part here that maybe it's not as bad as it looks, or?
What I'm trying to figure out, I'd love to see the data, right, on no different than marriage.
Right,
So the
right.
challenge is that, like, if you look at marriage, it's been incredible.
What data would you want to see?
Well, I think that, I mean, at some point,
Like giving, attendance?
yeah, but also I think there's a core component of that group that, they're strong, they're there, right? It's no different than you think about marriage, right? The rest of society does not see that as a kind of a vehicle for cohabitation, right? Like marriage doesn't even exist. They don't even live together anymore. Like that concept doesn't exist. And that's what I get worried about. And the only other thing I think about is status. So there's a really cool book this year written on status. And status is not like people give you that.
Right,
It's
right,
not
right.
like there's not, I mean, it's a
Right.
really interesting dynamic. Status has been here for thousands of years. And so it's so fascinating to see, like in 2022, the status of religion. There really probably was a tipping point, right? When it was like,
Sure.
I have to go to church because like,
Right.
that's what we do.
Right.
And then at some point, like, no, we have soccer practice on Sunday morning. It's like, I have the same conflict, right? Oh my gosh, I mean,
Yeah.
Sunday morning? Like,
Yeah, so the loss of status.
right. It's like, I can't do that. Like, what are you crazy?
Right.
I would never do that.
Uh-huh.
So I find that just so fascinating to see.
Well, I'll be really interested in your response then to what I'm going to say next week, using your analogy. No, seriously, it'll be really interesting.
Well, I'll follow up on that. While there may have been shrinkage, I feel like people in churches today are more intense in their faith.
Okay.
But maybe less willing to call themselves Christian. I have a very good friend who, if somebody asks her if she's Christian, she says, "What do you mean by that?"
Uh-huh.
And that is so sad to me.
Uh-huh.
But I absolutely understand what she means by doing that.
Yeah.
And so we kind of need to take the phrase over or take it back.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. As a professional clergy person on an airplane, what do you do for a living? For 30 years, I would start by saying, have you ever heard a bad sermon? And they would be like, what? I go, have you ever heard a bad sermon? Yes. I go, oh, I fix those. So, I mean, instead of just saying I'm a minister, I'm a professor at seminary, whatever. So, I mean, but it's telling that we got to a place where you would say, what do you mean by that? They didn't want to be out, to use that term.
No, they don't want to be,
Associated with the negative part.
well, yeah, exactly. They don't want to be associated with the word because the word has so many negatives attached to it.
Sure, yeah. Yeah.
Well, then you also get to, what's the point? What's the end goal? Is the end goal having a lot more people who say they're Christians, Or is the end goal having people who live in a society that's what God wants us to be? And Christianity and the church is sort of the path I've chosen to try to get there, but it doesn't look very positive for that. I mean, if I'm negative about anything, that the end goal would be what I'm negative about.
Uh-huh. All right, well, next week there is good news.
Yeah, here we go.
I promise you, there is some good news. Thanks for coming.